Well, hello. Thanks very much for having me here. Great to be here, even though I almost didn't make it because of flight problems. But I'm here after perhaps the wrong person to quote O.J. Simpson running through the airport about 5 or 6 times. But I'm here. In any case, I'm very honored to be here at an institution named after a man whose presidency served as a powerful force for justice, fairness, and social change. And it's because I'm here at the Clinton School that I'd like to think back 16 years ago for a moment to 1992 when Bill Clinton was running for president. Do you remember all those articles back at those days about baby boomers taking charge? I remember when Bill Clinton chose Al Gore, it was the baby boom ticket. Newsweek, in a cover article, called it the 60s coming of age. At their convention, you heard one of the ballads to the baby boom generation, Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. And Bill Clinton himself spoke constantly about how the 1960s were his formative years in terms of his political development. He referred to John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the conflict, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. It was indeed, at the time, perceived as the triumph of baby boom politics. Now let's fast forward to today. Baby boomers are in the prime of our lives, from the mid-40s to the early 60s. We are, right now, the largest generational voting bloc in politics today. Yet look at our 4 candidates. 2 of them, John McCain and Joe Biden, were born before the baby boom generation. John McCain, 1936, Joe Biden, 1942. And 2 who fall into the baby boom generation demographically, Barack Obama and Sarah Palin, Obama 1961, Palin 1964, pretty much distance themselves from boomers and for the most part say that they have little in common with baby boom politics. Now the one self-identified boomer, Hillary Clinton, the one who received national attention in 1969 when she gave this very boomer-esque commencement speech at Wellesley College, who has been seen as a poster child along with her husband for the baby boom generation, she was vanquished by somebody who specifically said we have to get beyond the politics of the baby boom generation, Barack Obama. What he said was, in his book, Audacity of Hope, time to get beyond the political, quote, psychodrama of the baby boom generation. He called it a tale rooted in old grudges and revenge plots hatched on a handful of college campuses long ago, played out on the national stage. So here we have, in the time of baby boom preeminence, boomers at the height of their professional situation, heading corporations, members of Congress, nonprofit organizations. We don't have a single self-identified boomer running on the ticket for the White House this year. And the man leading in the polls right now, who many pundits expect to be the next president of the United States, has denounced baby boom culture and politics. Well, I'm not going to take Barack Obama at his word. And I'm going to suggest that far from being a rejection of baby boomers, the 2008 election is in many ways an embrace of baby boomers. And I'll go even one step further to say that Barack Obama, despite distancing himself from the baby boom, may turn out to be as much of a boomer president, if not more so, than Bill Clinton. So let me explain why. Let's travel back 4 years ago when George Bush defeated John Kerry for the presidency of the United States. You remember the big story afterwards? The big story afterwards was about the moral values voter. Remember all of that? The morals value voter. That these were the ordinary Americans who sat in the red state pews who were really the ones who were going to be driving American politics for a long time. These were, in many ways, the direct descendants of Richard Nixon's silent majority. They were the anti-boomers, the ones who pushed back against the 1960s and stood for real American values, for Main Street parades and sturdy white men who were the backbone of American society. So what were the issues that drove so much of the dialogue 4 years ago? Vietnam. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, and yet 29 years later, we were still refighting the tensions and anxieties and conflicts of the Vietnam War. Gay marriage. It was on the ballot in states around the country, and gay marriage was seen as the triumph of a baby boom culture that was not going to be allowed to happen. And we talked a lot about religious values and how we needed to get back to the notion of faith. Now, if you listen to the media 4 years ago, it's as if they discovered something new. They kept beating themselves up after this moral values finding came out, saying, my gosh, we missed the real America, and now that real America was going to be the focus of our coverage. The problem is, the media were wrong. Now, I'm a big friend of the media. I teach a lot of potential journalists at the university, and I have a lot of friends in the news, and I'm actually part of the news myself at times. But I think it's very typical of the media, because sometimes I think when they think that they're actually looking straight ahead into the future, what they're really doing is looking into a rear view mirror. What they were reporting in 2004 was more a wave of the past than it was a wave of the future. They were like the media, the press in the early 1920s that were maybe covering the latest actions of the prohibitionists, when in fact prohibition was actually their last hurrah, and the world was changing right in front of them. So why did the media miss it? And that's a very important point, because politics doesn't always reflect cultural change. In fact, politics is often behind changes that are going on in the culture. The illusion that there is a predominant and rising moral values majority in America comes about because who votes in the greatest numbers? The older cohorts of our population. And because the older cohorts of our population vote in the greatest numbers, many of them pre-baby boomers, they're living longer, voting in greater numbers, voting in a far greater proportion than younger voters. So what happens is that because if you look at election results to reflect the culture, what you end up seeing is the idea of the mainstream that actually represents the values of the past rather than the values of the future. Now, I'm soon approaching the age where I'll be the values of the past, so I have nothing against that. But I think it's important that we not misrepresent what's happening in our culture, because politics and culture are often not in sync. So those values of the past, I argue, are no longer the real moral compass of our country. And in fact, I would say that what's emerged since the 1960s, brought about by baby boomers and their kids, who I often call boomers without the 60s, is a new morality, a new set of norms, and a new worldview that's fundamentally different from the old and traditionalist silent majority worldview that has predominated for so many years in our culture, and particularly in our politics. Now, you have to look at the differences in morality because it's important. What the older generations and more traditionalist view of morality is it's about your private life. Morality is about how we behave, what we do sexually. Now, boomers flipped that on its head and said that what you do in private is your business as long as you don't harm anybody else. And in fact, morality is what we do in public. It's whether our country is living up to its ideals. So today we have new moral values. Diversity and pluralism are moral values in our country. Discrimination, prejudice, and intolerance are immoral. In fact, we're actually wary of those who want to impose their morality on our private decisions, but we want our public institutions and public life to live up to our ideals of non-discrimination and inclusion. In this new morality, people should be free to be who they are. They shouldn't be hated or resented just because they're different. And actually, if you're one of those who hates or resents those people who are different, then you're immoral. And I can almost guarantee that that is the morality that every single one of my students, liberal or conservative in my classrooms, agrees with, thinks, and internalizes. So that's the new morality, and it's especially powerful among young people. So let me give you a few examples of this. A very interesting little bit of numbers I found in the 2006 midterm election. Wisconsin had a referendum on gay marriage. And the referendum basically went against gay marriage. But look at the numbers, because they're fascinating. 67% of those born before 1946 opposed gay marriage. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, however, 60% supported gay marriage. That is a fundamental shift in where our culture is. And on most issues, on issues of gender, on issues of race, on issues of ethnicity, on issues of personal freedom, the older generations tend to be more socially conservative. The younger generations, whether you are politically liberal or conservative or not, tend to be more socially liberal. And this is reflective of a culture shift that's been going on ever since the 1960s, when the baby boom generation took on the values and norms of the older generation and said, we have to change. But this culture change, this shift, hasn't shown up in our elections yet. I quote George Will, who said a few years back that politics seems peripheral to and largely impotent against cultural forces and institutions that are permeated with what conservatives consider the 60s sensibility. And if you actually look at the numbers, even Ronald Reagan couldn't slow down this cultural change. So a culture that once denied the diversity of our country now increasingly celebrates it and accepts it. A culture that once saw a woman's role only in the home now celebrates women's role in the office, in the sports arena, in the courtroom, in the doctor's office, in the halls of Congress, as well as in the home. You have to remember what it was like years ago. In 1972, the Washington Post still ran separate classified ads for men and women, for jobs for men and jobs for women. 1972. And in fact, I went and looked back at some of those classifieds for women back in the 1950s, and I found some absolutely stunning things, like girl, attractive, 5'5" to 5'7" in heels. That was your credential for a job. Back in the 50s, women were considered too emotional for politics, science, business, even jury duty. If you went to Harvard Law in the 1960s, the dean would often bring women in and say, first week, say, why are you taking the place of a man? And it wasn't unusual well into the 1980s for judges to refer to female attorneys as lawyerettes or attorney generalette. It was perceived at the time that if a girl wanted to play sports, well, she couldn't make it full court, so it wasn't unusual for female basketball to be limited to half-court games. And if you wanted to get a mortgage, you often had to get a man to co-sign it for you. In fact, I remember after I wrote my book, somebody wrote to me and said, I tried to get a mortgage, even though I had a job and a career, and I had to sign an affidavit that I was on the birth control pill. In 1957, 80% of Americans said that a woman who is unmarried had to be either sick, neurotic, or immoral. Now, even today, some of our traditionalists blame society's problems on working women. That's not an uncommon thread in James Dobson's work, who's the head of Focus on Family. And isn't it the Southern Baptist Convention, which actually passed a proposition a while back saying that women should submit to men? But that's the wave of the past, not the wave of the future. So we have changed, and we've changed profoundly in very fundamental ways. We tend to idealize the 1950s, the happy days, and Leave It to Beaver, and Father Knows Best. That's the real America. But trust me, it isn't today. I showed in my class on the baby boom generation last semester, the first class, before I said a word to my class, I put up a Father Knows Best episode in which Betty, who was the older daughter, was competing for the best grades and the biggest honors at school with a guy. And they would compete, and they would fight, and they would be jealous and all the rest. And after he, of course, won, and then after graduation, they went to compete for a job. And it turns out she's going for a job interview, and who shows up? Her nemesis, this guy. And they're competing fiercely for this job, and of course she is given the responsibility of modeling clothes, and he's given the responsibility of management. But finally, after all this competition, they're at this sort of bridal show, and she goes out and dresses up as the bride, and the male model didn't happen to show, so they forced this guy out that she was competing with, and she says under her breath to him, "I now know how I can outcompete you, and something that you can't do, I can become a bride." And the jaws of every single one of my students dropped to the floor. It was a different culture back then. 50 years ago, in parts of this country, Barack Obama would not be able to vote for himself for President of the United States. And 50 years ago, in a poll, 94% of white people disapproved of white and non-white marriage, yet today, the son of one of those marriages may be elected the president. Think about it. In 1963, a survey found that nearly 40% of white people wouldn't try on clothes that blacks had tried on in a store. Yet today, millions of whites will make one of the most intimate and personal decisions possible in politics, voting for a black man for President of the United States. Now, I could go on and say more about what it was like back then. That if you were Jewish, you were advised to be inconspicuous, and your children were read to from the Christian Bible in public schools. That if you were gay, you could be routinely arrested for perversion or immorality, and if you were a woman who dressed in pants, you could be arrested for dressing too manly. Trust me, that is true. That young kids who seemed too effeminate were sometimes forced into electric shock therapy, induced vomiting, even hormone injections. If you were a man with a beard walking around a community, it wasn't unusual for you to be questioned by police because maybe you were sinister or maybe there was something vaguely un-American about you. So anyone who was different, who marched to a different drum, or who prayed to a different God, you were told, stay silent, don't rock the boat, and conform. That was part of America at that time. But it's different now. And it's largely different because the baby boomers in the 60s began to change all of this. They took on institution by institution, family by family, value by value, attitude by attitude. And guess what? I think, my own view, is that we are a far better society today because of that. And it just wasn't the 60s, it was doing it in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and in this decade as well. Because social change doesn't happen by snapping your fingers. It's not Samantha wiggling her nose and everything changes. But because these changes seem so much a natural part of our lives, we take it for granted. We take for granted that it's always been this way, yet it hasn't always been this way. And in fact, when we look back on the 60s, we often think about Vietnam and civil rights and all the rest, but what was really going on, it was a cultural revolution. That's the most powerful lesson from that. Daniel Yankelovich, the great public opinion pollster, said initially, in the 60s, the nature of this cultural revolution was disguised by the Vietnam War protests, but when the war ended, the unrest on campus turned out to be not essentially about anti-war protests and radical politics, but rather about cultural values. So we live in a fundamentally different America today, what I call, for lack of a better term, sounding with incredible hubris, the baby boom America. And we live by a new morality that grew out of the baby boom's generational battle to end the conflict between our ideals and how we were living up to them. So that brings me back to this election to suggest that this may well be the last election of the 1960s. Because in so many previous elections, fear of the 60s, fear of these social changes, were able to rouse that old silent majority that voted in far greater numbers than everybody else, and with their vote, it enabled them to refight the cultural battles that began in the 60s and basically to express their worldview. It's perfectly fine. Everybody has that right. But the older generations always vote in greater numbers than the younger generation, and therefore those values tend to be overrepresented in our political culture. But now our politics and our culture are catching up with each other. And in large part, it's because of the younger generation, who I think in many ways have a very 1960s worldview. I call them boomers without the 60s. They're replacing older voters who have an older sensibility. Yet they're very moral in their worldview. So I don't want people to think that just because they have a different morality, that they're less moral. They're very moral in their worldview. So what's happening as older voters move on, younger voters move in. That's the case all the time in society. And this year in particular, the older voting cohort is of a much smaller demographic, the silent generation. And the people moving in is the echo boom, one of the largest generation, if not the largest generation in terms of numbers, rivaling the baby boom generation in our history. So, what could happen? If younger voters vote in ways that they say they're going to vote, and that's a big if, you may see that cultural change that's taking place finally find its way in our political culture. Now, it hasn't kept some from trying to make this election about the 60s and to hit the same old buttons that have been hit before. If it was Willie Horton in 1988, it's the Reverend Jeremiah Wright today. If it was Bill Clinton's Vietnam War issues in 1992, it's about William Ayers, the former Weather Underground radical, but who turned into the, I think, 1996 or 1997 Chicago Citizen of the Year, who was representative of this. It's the same playbook being fought out there again and again. And what's trying to be accomplished? Well, you accomplish the fact by you make a candidate seem more radical. You make a candidate seem to be identified with black anger, which was so anxiety-producing for white people in the 1960s and 1970s. You make him seem as somebody who wants to surrender the same way that people accuse Vietnam War protesters of wanting to surrender. And then you bring out your silent majority symbol, in this case, Joe the Plumber, and make him representative of a culture that you say symbolizes those old values of sturdiness, working hard, working class values. Now, it might have been enough in the years past to accomplish it, but I'm not really sure it's going to work this year. And I don't think it will work this year, in large part because I do think younger voters will go out and vote in larger numbers and finally stop disenfranchising themselves in elections, which effectively they do by voting in numbers in lower proportions than the rest of the population. But because these attacks aren't working, now again, I don't want to be too premature because there are 2 weeks left. So you never know what's going to happen. And I don't know how many of you are listening to some of those robocalls that are being made. Okay? They're pretty rough, really making Barack Obama as like tightest buddies, bosom buddies with William Ayers. But I'm not sure they're going to work. So I'm going to assume that they won't. And I'm going to assume that because they're not working, that's why we're seeing some of the anger and vitriol out there directed at Barack Obama. Because I think what's happening is that people who want to hang on to the old America don't want to see that America pass on. You hear it in talk radio. You hear it at some of these Sarah Palin rallies, where you just don't want to hear those types of things about somebody who's running for the President of the United States. I don't care which party, who you support. Kill him is not an appropriate phrase to be directed at anybody running for President of the United States. Just the other day, Governor Palin proclaimed that there's a real America. She said that there's a real America. I'm here in the real America, and she called it patriotic, pro-American areas of our country that basically support her ticket. What does that say about the rest of the country? Is the rest of the country not real Americans? Are they not patriotic? Are they not pro-American? But you begin to see the whole idea that there is a real America, and there are these pretenders coming in trying to take it over, because we've been so conditioned for years to seeing that old silent majority is the real America and not accepting the fact that one of the most wonderful things about this country is its ability to change and for the people to adapt to change and to deal with changing circumstances and acknowledge new realities. Now, if you go back 150 years ago when the Industrial Revolution was transforming the English countryside, you had people going from town to town, bashing machines, burning down factories. They were known as Luddites. And they were very angry, and they were very loud, because the world was changing in front of them, and their way of life was no longer central, and that there were new forms of authority and new forms of culture that were beginning to dominate and take over British society at the time. But as loud as they were the wave of the past and not the future. And if you're angry enough in our country, or even in history, you can get noticed. And you can give the illusion that anger represents a lot of people. But it doesn't always. It's just that the media sometimes reward anger and outrage because they love a good story. So that's how I see the vitriol in our election today. And whether Obama wins or loses in the long run, I think what's happening is you're seeing part of our culture worried that they are no longer the dominant part of our culture and unwilling to share it with other people in our culture. And there's a lot of anger associated with that, as there is with any group of people that feels like their position of dominance is being threatened and that they no longer have the upper hand in society. Now, in that context, I think that Barack Obama, despite the fact that he rejects the baby boom generation, may end up being even more of a boomer president than Bill Clinton. You see, Bill Clinton was president at a time when the new culture was still struggling against the old. When racial politics and wedge issues, the same stuff that Richard Nixon used in the late 60s and early 70s to rouse the silent majority, they were still the language of politics in the time that Bill Clinton was president. So he was president at a time of tension between the old and new culture, when it was really, really intense. Now, here was a very moderate president. His policies were moderate, yet the hostility he faced was all out of proportion to his policies. And you got to ask, why was that the case? I think it was because he was a symbol of the new culture, and the old culture didn't want him to take over and set the terms of debate. Newt Gingrich famously called him a counterculture McGovernich, as if he were up in the White House doing illicit drugs and you know, sort of dancing to Woodstock with light shows on the roof of the Lincoln bedroom. I used to think that Bill Clinton, when one of his first policy decisions on gays in the military, I used to think that was a huge political mistake. And it may have been a political mistake. But in some ways, it was truly an honorable effort to instill the values of this new morality, that all people have dignity, and we should accept and include them for who they are. You can't get a better expression of this new morality than what Bill Clinton tried to do and got beaten back on because he might have done it too fast, ahead of where our politics were. Now, Barack Obama, if he becomes president, will face enormous issues. I mean, our economic meltdown, the war in Iraq, terrorism, Afghanistan. But if he wins, he'll be presiding over this new culture without the same degree of culture war anger that Bill Clinton faced. His very persona symbolizes this new culture, and that's why so many young people are flocking to him. You look at the polling numbers, they're astonishing on the younger generation. 60-40, 65-35. And why? I think it's because his very personhood symbolizes this new culture. His background bridges our racial divide. How much more healing can you get than somebody whose life is an expression of bridging that racial divide? He's global in perspective, background, and education. He's obviously comfortable with very strong women in his life. And he has that early 1960s idealism. You know, if you go back to one of the famous documents of the baby boom generation, the Port Huron Statement, which was written in 1962, a year after Barack Obama was born, they talk about participatory democracy, about getting the grassroots to get involved and to put pressure on the special interests so that the people will be heard as a counterbalance to what the special interests are doing. That's what his political philosophy is all about, energizing people at the grassroots. And also, in true new culture sort of phenomenon, he does seem to represent youthful energy and hope, the same way John Kennedy ran on that platform effectively in the 1960 election. Probably many of you don't remember this or know this, but in 1966, Time magazine made its Man of the Year the under 25 generation. That was it, and they called it Man of the Year back then. Now, Barack Obama was 5 years old then, but if you read Time and see what they said about this emerging baby boom generation, you'll see that in many ways it sums up who Obama really is. Time said, this is a generation of dazzling diversity. It's not just a new generation, but a new kind of generation, one that would infuse the future with a new sense of morality, a transcendent and contemporary ethic that could infinitely enrich the empty society. I think Time was very prescient back then. Now, I saw what Colin Powell said about Barack Obama yesterday, and he used very similar words yesterday that Time magazine used to describe the baby boom generation back 42 years ago. Hope, idealism, transcendence. So it may well be that if Barack Obama is elected president on November 4th, he could become the president of the United States that boomers have been waiting for all of these years. And in 2 weeks, we will find out. So I'm very happy to take questions and comments and have a conversation with you on some of this. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear you. Right here.
Oh, thank you for a fascinating talk. I wonder, though, if you're not being too optimistic about the new generation overtaking the old, given the fact that prior to the financial meltdown, the candidates were essentially dead even, and given the probability that Obama is a more attractive candidate than McCain.
So the question is, we're giving too much credit to the new generation over the old because of the financial meltdown issue. I actually thought that in some ways that Obama's candidacy was about 8 to 12 years early for this new generation fully to take place and for the United States of America to accept an African-American candidate without people bringing up the Bradley effect and race and all the rest of that in voting. But it's funny because if you actually look at all of these sort of non-boomer candidates, you look at John McCain. John McCain is part of what he calls speaking truth to power, which was this sort of fundamental tenet of where boomers have been at for all these years. Sarah Palin, career woman, okay, which is funny because what she seems to represent contradicts in some ways much of what the religious right which supports her believes in. Yet here's somebody who epitomizes in many ways the empowerment of women that boomers have been working for, whether you agree with her or not. It's what she symbolizes. And of course, Hillary Clinton, sort of going toe-to-toe with Barack Obama as being very much of a very strong woman in society, and potentially, if not for Barack Obama, potentially becoming president of the United States as the first female president. So I was thinking that all of these elements were in place, and I wasn't sure when they were going to crystallize. And I did think that Obama's candidacy obviously is helped along by circumstances, but I also think that if you actually look at the polls over the summertime, Obama was ahead of John McCain. Before McCain went and attacked him and sort of had sort of the Moses parting the waters, sarcastic ads, and before the Sarah Palin bump, the excitement associated with that. But if you also look at the numbers on it, the polls generally were not reflecting and had not reflected younger voters. If you look at what a likely voter screen is on a poll, you'll see that one of the key questions they ask as to whether you're going to be a likely voter is whether you voted for before, okay? And they'll also ask people, do you know where you're going to vote? So the likely voter screen cuts out a lot of those people who may well be likely voters. And in fact, the Gallup poll in August, I saw some of the internals on that, they had only 10% of the vote in the 18 to 29-year-old cohort, when in fact in 2004, the 18 to 29s accounted for, I think, 17% of the vote, and most people expect it to increase this time around as well. So I think the polls are somewhat misleading because they're not showing who may come out to vote and who's serious about voting on all of this. And that's why I think, in fact, that Obama's strength has not really fallen in these poll numbers throughout. It's just that McCain's began to increase and tie him up after what was a very successful convention. So I do think that to some extent we're a few years ahead of where all of this might have crystallized. But I think the fact that it's happening right now tells you how much our culture has permeated our society and how much it really is on the verge of being matched by our political system. Thanks.
Annie? Hold on, Annie. Hold on, Annie.
In following your evolution of cultural changes, I want to identify a superficial, maybe, symbol of this intergenerational coalescing of the symbol of tattoos. I've been following that for some time. And when you look, you see 3 generations walking down the street. The grandma, the mother, the teenager, and maybe the great-grandbaby, all have tattoos. But what distinguishes them is what the tattoo says, where the tattoo is. What is that telling us about this intergenerational merger of cultures?
Well, I think you have a book on tattoos waiting to be written, but without getting into the actual placement of tattoos on the body, what's really interesting is that researchers have found that we have the lowest generation gap now since people have been looking into that. There is very little disparity in terms of values and attitudes between boomers, Generation X, millennials, their kids, whatever you want to call all of this, okay? In fact, I often think that, and I know this will probably anger some people, but I often think that Generation X really isn't a generation, it's a cohort. Because the sociological definition of a generation is something of a shared identity. And when you call yourselves by the letter X, it suggests a lack of identity, but what's interesting about it is if you go and look at the attitudes, and I've done a lot of time looking at the General Social Survey. If you've never looked at it, it's online. It's absolutely tremendous resource. But if you look at these attitudes, there's very little difference between boomers, Generation X, today's young people. And in fact, today's young people tend to be even more socially liberal than boomers. What I think happened was that boomers fought hard to instill these norms in society, and the younger generation is actually living out those norms. That's why you're seeing so little of a generation gap on this. So, and actually, if you look at those numbers versus people born earlier, you do see a generation gap. Okay? Now, again, I think a country is great and greater if we have a diversity of viewpoints represented. But I am a boomer, and I do believe that pluralism is one of the greatest ideas that we can have, which is to respect a society with many different viewpoints, and it can flourish that way because it's energized. We learn from each other. We hear from each other, that one doesn't have to be imposed on the other. And I think that's where young people are today, but honestly, that's where boomers are, and that's why really there's no generation gap between them. So yes, tattoos may be one example. Texting may be another example. I mean, who here who's over the age of 40 is able to text with their thumbs? Not many of us. I still do the hunt and peck method, okay? But the very fact that we're now doing it more is another symbol, like your tattoos, that we are all merging together.
Any question right here?
I watched Colin Powell Sunday, and I watched him at least twice in excerpts. It's probably the most powerful 5 or 6 minutes I've heard in my life. I mean, he had everything down, and he said it, and he was convincing when he said it. Okay, that brings me to my question. On the 30th of October, Barack Obama is going to give a half-hour American address to the entire United States on TV. Will he be able to do something similar to that and defuse the Muslim issue, the William Ayers issue, and now the thing of spreading the wealth is coming out again now? Do you think with his oratory skills he will be able to convince the American people of what he's about and what he stands for?
So the question is, will Barack Obama on October 30th be able to convince the American people what he's about and address some of these charges? Some would say he addressed them to some extent during the third debate, some of the charges there. I think look, Barack Obama, the extraordinary thing about his candidacy is he has so many things going against him that would otherwise, to many other candidates not be going against him. He's unfamiliar. Whether he's black or white, he's unfamiliar. In 1960, a lot of people thought, how is John Kennedy going to prove that he can beat a sitting and knowledgeable vice president? It was very hard. I mean, here's somebody who the American people didn't know all that well. And he was Catholic, and he had that to sort of show that he was just one of us, okay? So Barack Obama, besides racial issues and his youth, and the fact that no Democrat since 1976 has gotten over 50% of the vote. In fact, if you look at the Democratic Party, Franklin Roosevelt in 1944 got 53% of the vote. Lyndon Johnson, during his landslide in 1964, was the only one to get 60. The next Democrat to get over 50% was 50% plus a hair, Jimmy Carter, and not a single Democrat since has gotten over 50% of the vote. I argue, in many ways, because the Democratic Party has become associated with this new culture and therefore has had an uphill battle given the demographics of voting patterns, okay? So I think what Barack Obama has to be able to do is to continually reintroduce himself to the American people, show who he is inside, show how much he cares deeply about the people of this country, show in some ways how he can't believe what politics is trying to do to him, and asking us all to think about what politics is not just doing to him, but doing to us if caricature can replace reality. And he has to be able to lay out a very safe, secure plan for the American people to be able to attach themselves to and to make it understandable. I do think there are risks involved with this. Being a talking head for 30 minutes, if he does that, may turn people off. The last one to pull that off was Ross Perot, but that's because he had all those zany charts and, and figures standing there, and it was somewhat entertaining, but it worked. So I think the Obama people have to be very careful about having him not appear to be talking to us for 30 minutes. They have to show him talking with us and have to humanize him in a way that his opponents are trying to dehumanize him. So my hunch is that in their Chicago campaign back room, they're trying to figure out what's the best way to make use of this 30 minutes so we actually do humanize this man and make him seem out to be less alien, very experienced, one of us, somebody who feels all of our emotions, feels our pain, as Bill Clinton said, but somebody who can also rise to a position of leadership and vision for the 21st century. So I think it's going to be hard, but if you like him, you should be thankful that he's raised so much money and is able to afford it, because I don't think any other candidate's been able to do anything like that in years.
You mentioned Bill Clinton and the clash between kind of the older morality and the new morality, and you also mentioned a little bit that maybe this is coming to fruition a little earlier than it might otherwise. So if Barack Obama is to become president, what do you think the chances are of him being able to be a great president and not have these clashes bring him down to where he can't be successful?
I think the question is, Bill Clinton was sort of tied down by some of the culture war hostilities, and if it's still a bit premature for Obama, what's going to keep him from being tied down on all of that? I think it's far less salient than it was years ago. I think that's why. My own view is that I'm thrilled that people have different worldviews in a culture. And I think that's healthy for society. It keeps us all honest. And that's what democracy is all about. But I think it's so less salient. And talk radio has already been there, done that, okay? The Rush Limbaugh angry rants are not going to have the same power that they had when Bill Clinton was president. And I think people, especially young people, are going to say, now is our time to start redirecting America to the future. And I think young people will be a strong and constant voice on all of this. So I think to some extent you will see Barack Obama try to tap that idealism of youth, the way John Kennedy tried to do that. And I think America may become very enamored with the way young people will take him up on his offer and actually commit themselves to such things as public service and volunteering and the Peace Corps and all other types of idealistic things young people do. And so to some extent, I because I think it's less salient than it was during Bill Clinton, and because I think young people want to be, heard, I think that's going to serve as the counterbalance on all of this. But Obama has to get out of the box quickly and tap that idealism. He has to have his John Kennedy inaugural moment talking about passing the torch to a new generation. And he has to be able to talk about that. And boomers, since we get along so well with the younger generation, we're going to be thrilled by it, and we're not going to be threatened by it. Because you know what? We still see ourselves as the youth generation.
We have time for one more question.
Boy, I hate to follow that with this thought, but I went to graduate school in evolutionary biology right there in the middle of the Vietnam and the women's lib and all of that. And evolutionary theory, as my professors even had equations for this, and a study of different animals would say, it's the business of young people to be radical, it's the business of old people to be conservative. And that once the young people grow to be old people, they become conservative and keep on all of those conservative values. And I might say I'm 1 year away from being eligible for Medicare, so I'm anxious to see if that happens to myself.
Well, you can be our test case. But that's part of the life cycle theory of development. And I actually think that there's going to be sort of a reverse life cycle with boomers. You see already that retirement patterns of boomers, that boomers just don't want to go to the old golf course and hang around playing bridge in the evening. You're seeing, for example, boomers asking for retirement facilities around colleges and universities. You're seeing increasing boomer retirement in urban centers. You're seeing boomers asking to find second businesses, careers, or even volunteering. I mean, we'll be a nuisance till they carry us away. And we'll be in the old age home with Mick Jagger blasting over the speakers. And I think to some extent, we thrive on young people sort of breaking the china. And we thrive on young people trying new things. We empower them to do this. We want them to do this. So in that sense, whereas boomers had to fight constantly to be able to accomplish these things and to change things, it was a battle, and everybody who remembers that time, whether you're on the parent side or the kid side, it was a battle for everything. For your hair. I remember we had a sit-in in my high school to be able to wear shorts to school. Everything had meaning and value. Boomers, on the other hand, want to wear shorts? Go ahead. Okay? Do what you want. Express yourself. Personal freedom. Find yourself. Do that because it becomes a far richer society. So I think the life cycle theory that hasn't yet accommodated how baby boomers are going to be at our crusty old age. So.
Well, let's thank Professor Steinhorn for that great lecture.
Thanks.